Hi, my name is Lindsay and I'm going to explain the effects of baking soda and baking powder in cakes. Baking powder and baking soda are leavening agents, meaning they help make cakes rise. Although they look and seem similar in general, they're actually quite contrasting and have different impacts on cakes. Baking soda, also known as sodium bicarbonate, is a naturally occurring chemical compound. To use baking soda in a baking recipe, there must be some sort of acid in there, like cream of tartar. When baking soda and an acid are combined with a liquid, CO2 gas bubbles are released, creating the light and airy texture that we see in this case, cake batter. Another example of this reaction is the classic science fair volcano project, where you mix baking soda and vinegar to create the explosion. Baking powder is a dry chemical leavening agent, and it's used when there are no acidic ingredients in a recipe. Inside of baking powder, you can find three things: sodium bicarbonate, aka baking soda, an acid, like cream of tartar, and cornstarch. The baking soda and acid are there to give your cake an airy texture, and the cornstarch is there to prevent the baking soda and acid from reacting with one another and starting to produce CO2 inside the box. So, when baking powder is mixed with a liquid, CO2 gas bubbles will be created, giving your cake a very similar fluffy texture as to cakes with baking soda. If you didn't have baking soda or baking powder in your cake would come out of the oven looking like this. As you can see in this loaf cake, it's extremely dense and didn't rise whatsoever because there was no leavening agent. Okay, so you're probably thinking, well, what's the difference between baking powder and baking soda if they do the same thing? Well, as previously mentioned, baking soda is a naturally occurring chemical compound, meaning baking soda is solely baking soda, whereas baking powder is a mix of ingredients. This means that the baking powder has less concentration of sodium bicarbonate than baking soda. So, for my experiment, I baked 3 sponge cakes, one with only baking powder, one with only baking soda, and one with half baking soda and half baking powder. For this study, I want to preface that there is no cross-contamination between the different cake batters, so this is a completely fair evaluation. As you can see here, these are the 3 cakes after being taken out of the oven. On the left is the cake with both baking powder and baking soda, and I'll be referring to this cake as cake 1. In the middle is the baking soda cake, which will be known as cake 2. Finally, cake 3 is on the right, which is the baking powder cake. Firstly, I'm going to talk about cake 3. Now, do you remember when I was talking about how baking powder is a weaker leavening agent because it's less concentrated? Well, it may be hard to see on the screen, but this cake was by far the flattest cake and sadly turned out the worst. This cake was somewhat firm and not as bouncy compared to the other cakes, and it also rose the least. This is cake 1, aka the baking soda and baking powder cake. This cake seemed to have an airier texture and rose more than cake 3. Lastly is the baking soda cake, cake 2. This was the fluffiest and airiest cake out of all 3. It rose the most and had great bubbles. Also, since I didn't want to waste perfectly good cakes, I'm going to be making a strawberry matcha cake in the final part of the video. So, from what we've learned in this video, we can tell that these results were attributed to the concentration of sodium bicarbonate in each of the cakes, as sodium bicarbonate is what makes cakes rise and what gives them their fluffy and airy texture. My personal advice is to bake your cakes with baking soda, but to be completely honest, you can bake your cakes with whatever leavening agent you'd like, or if you want to do a mix, that's completely fine too, because they both work well in their own ways. It just depends on what's available to you and your personal preference of texture. Finally, here's the finished cake, which turned out really well. The leavening agents created a nice fluffy texture, and there weren't any noticeable differences between any of the layers taste-wise. That's it. Thanks for watching my presentation.